Imagine the twilight of May 1809, during the Battle of Ospern-Essling, where the waters of the Danube were stained a piercing, incandescent orange by the setting sun. At the edge of a battlefield where the acrid smoke had yet to dissipate, Napoleon, Emperor of the French, knelt in the mire, clutching a general whose legs had been shattered by a cannonball and whose uniform was drenched in gore. That general, in a faltering whisper, was bidding a final farewell to the only man in the world who dared address the emperor by his first name. His name was Jean Lannes. Tonight, by the rhythmic pulse of the hearth and through this narrative meant to be felt rather than merely memorized, let us step into the true odyssey of his life. He was the purest god of war under Napoleon, a legend who clawed his way from a stable apprentice in a remote village to a marshal of the empire. Though he had miraculously survived countless certain deaths, he exited the stage of his era at the very zenith of power and glory, in a manner both excruciatingly tragic and profoundly quiet. This is a story of class-defying ascent, of guarding sincere brotherhood within a blood and iron military, and of how to face the finality of fate after a life of ultimate fervor. The life of Jean Lannes began with a parched wind from the Gascony region in southern France. He was not born into a military dynasty, his father was but a humble horse dealer. Young Lannes woke every day to the scent of hay, learning to tame stubborn beasts. Yet, beneath his bright-eyed gaze beat a heart wilder than any stallion. When the thunder of the 1789 revolution echoed across the heavens, Lannes discarded his whip and donned the coarse blue uniform of the National Guard. He had never spent a single day in a military academy, yet his instinct for the battlefield was as unerring as a predator's scent for prey. In the mire of the Italian campaign, he first encountered an equally thin but sharp-eyed young man, Napoleon Bonaparte. At the Battle of Lodi, Napoleon watched as Lannes, clutching the tricolor flag, charged into a hail of grapeshot. It was then he realized that this Gascon would be the sharpest blade he would ever wield. This resilience, born of ascending from the very bottom, allowed him to quietly establish his own heroic totem amidst his steady, resolute footsteps. If Napoleon was the mind of France, Jean Lannes was its sturdiest bone. In the subsequent Egyptian expedition and the Battle of Marengo, Lannes materialized at every perilous breach. He was wounded countless times, a bullet once even pierced his throat, yet he invariably rose again like a divine miracle. However, this physical indestructibility only served to highlight the tenderness and sincerity of his soul. He was among the rare few of the imperial generals who dared to criticize Napoleon openly. When the emperor deified himself, Lannes would publicly remind him not to forget the soldiers freezing to death in the mud. This untimely sobriety led to his temporary marginalization and an ambassadorship in Portugal. Yet, in Lannes's eyes, titles and ranks were far less real than a draught of Gascon wine at midnight and a heartfelt chat with old comrades. This self-restraint became the profound, rugged bedrock of his life. In his silent steadfastness, he finally attained a warrior's peace, solitary, yet authentic. The spring of 1809 brought the most agonizing winter of Lannes's fate, the Battle of Ospern-Essling. It was a brutal war of attrition. The bridges over the Danube were severed by Austrian fireships, leaving the French army isolated on a narrow strip of riverbank. Lannes galloped across the lines, mending the unraveling order. As he sat down to catch his breath on the very grass where his comrade Pausat had just been killed, a heavy cannonball swept through the air, precisely severing his legs. It was the darkest afternoon in the history of the empire. Lannes was carried to the rear in agony, but he did not wail. He calmly watched the surgeons saw through his mangled limbs and asked those around him, "Does the emperor know?" During the 9 days that followed, Lannes engaged in a silent game of chess with death within his tent. Napoleon kept a daily vigil by his bed, clutching his hand, the only moment in the iron-hearted emperor's life when he appeared so vulnerable. In his moments of lucidity, Lannes offered his final counsel to Napoleon, telling him, "This war has no end, you should cease this expansion and return to your people." Jean Lannes's later years, had he been granted them, might have been spent as an old soldier basking in the sun of a southern French vineyard. But in reality, his twilight was compressed into those final 9 days. Lying on a makeshift bed, listening to the receding thunder of cannons, his inner clarity became sharper than ever before. He watched the generals who once feared him hovering outside his tent, and in his eyes, there was no longer anger, but a worldly pity. He knew the empire was marching toward its prophesied dusk, and he, the torchbearer, was fortunate enough to be extinguished before the darkness fully descended. This detachment, seeing through grandeur without harboring resentment, was his ultimate composure. In his final delirium, he still shouted commands for the assault, but in that moment, he had already transcended the boundaries of victory and defeat. He once described the essence of courage: it is not the absence of fear, but choosing to light the lamp within your heart even when you know a chasm lies ahead. This transition from extreme splendor to extreme desolation allowed his life, before it withered, to radiate a dignity as resilient and clean as iron plate. On May 31, 1809, Marshal Jean Lannes closed his eyes forever in the arms of Napoleon. As the news rippled through the Grande Armée, old soldiers who had never wept amidst the carnage took off their hats in unison. The entire camp fell into an awestruck, Lannes-esque silence. He departed with profound quietude, as if merely completing a guard change timed to the second. He provided the answer to the question from the prologue. He surrendered a life of potential luxury, but won an ultimate victory of loyalty and sobriety. And you now, do you feel it? That sense of peace, as cold and stable as iron armor, reaching across 2 centuries. The borders of France have long since shifted, and the banners of the eagle have returned to the dust. Only the pure bravery of Jean Lannes remains in the deep midnight of history, like a faint lamp that refuses to go out. This is a power that does not need to roar, the finality of a warrior's soul. Tonight, may you drift into sleep accompanied by the scent of gunpowder from Lannes's journals and the steadiness born of his absolute composure. The world has fallen silent. It is time for you to let go of the day's distractions. Good night.